When I think about resilience, I think about social resilience.
Everybody's talking about resilience now after the COVID pandemic, but resilience has characterized our cities for thousands of years. Resilience means how we can reuse the fabric we built with different functions. So cities are inherently resilient, and that's what we need to preserve as architects, designers, engineers.
I believe the resiliency is the flexibility within the built fabric, that it is shock-proof. Because we know things change, society will change, financial status quo will change, powers will shift, climate is shifting. So there's lots of recurring changes coming at us. So the more robust the systems we can imagine, the more resilient they are, the more long-lasting they will be in surviving, dealing with all these changes.
When we tackle today's big issues, think about a city, think about a complex building with a lot of intelligence, so things are becoming very complex and we need people from many, many different disciplines. And so then the question is, what is the role of the architect? I like to think about architects and designers tomorrow to be what we started calling choral architects. So the architect becomes some kind of conductor, being able to harmonize many different voices. And those voices are both the voices of technical people who can bring technical expertise, but also the voices of the people who will live in the city and buildings we design.
I see the role of the architect in the future going much more into the direction of consultant. You will not anymore be the designer alone, but you will be a public scientist or a director controlling and director, the specialist in the design process. And then of course edit the process and edit the ideas and give them direction.
If I look at myself in context, I traditionally trained as a designer, but actually a lot of what I do is facilitation. I don't traditionally design in the way that I do. And part of facilitation within design is understanding how you can kind of connect different agents in a way to kind of bring about positive change. And I think one thing that we're missing in society is actually recognizing people, consumers, part of the design process, not just as the end user of a product or a system or a service, but actually bringing them into the fold from the top down, so that whatever we design and produce and create is actually relevant and meets the needs in a genuine way. And I think sometimes we miss that step. We often see them as someone to design for rather than to design with.
I think the profession of the architect is, if you limit it to the architectural profession and thinking, designing, materializing a building for future generations, that will be kind of stuck within the box. But the way we approach our profession is that we don't take the current system for granted. We put the end user at the top of the command, and that's an alternative approach to what we see around us and maybe the way we're even trained.
What we say is also that there's other disciplines who have to be involved in the process of what we describe. It's also, you need a lot of knowledge about business models, financing, governance structures, process management, co-creation. You should also have these disciplines in order to maybe make these more circular neighborhoods.
4 years ago, I changed the name of my practice here in Milan. It's no longer called the Studio of Michele De Lucchi, but it's called the Circle. Circle means that it's just a community of different people, of different disciplines. And yes, I can mention psychanalysts, I can mention anthropologists.
We have to open up the conversation to other fields, whether it is biotechnology, whether it is science, whether it is medicines and body enhancement, whether it is philosophy or political studies. We have to tackle into different disciplines to understand different resolution of our work. We are not probably training our students to become architects in the classical sense. We are training them to be in conversation and be able to translate the instances coming from very different disciplines into spatial forms. Their ambition is not to go to work for the next big architecture office. Their ambition is to work for pharmaceutical companies, political entities, agricultural enterprises, and to understand how architects can actually operate within those domains. Only by bringing together all these disciplines, we will be able to actually generate the future of living, the future of cities, or the future of homes, the future of our environment at large.
How do we actually empower consumers to be part of the process instead of seeing them as external passive bystanders? I think it's really important that we actually integrate them into that space so that we can actually design ways that are relevant and design ways that are actually for a need rather than purely just because we can.
We think, first of all, the ideal project is owned by people. So there's not one person in charge or one owner of the land. We would like to give the land handed over to the community. So the community also decides how they want to live and work together. The Keuvel is one of the projects where we get really close to this. So there was a competition a couple of years ago where the municipality wanted on an old brownfield some workspaces, and they asked the market for come up with a solution because this brownfield was polluted. There was not much money to solve this pollution. Then we gathered some friends and people and experts together, and we made it our own project that we all thought with all expertise from the very beginning to come up with a concept. And this concept was there that we put park by the process of phytoremediation, so the plants clean the soil. Then we used old second-hand houseboats, refurbished them and made them more sustainable, and made a place with workplaces which were extremely affordable for the people who all contributed. So this is one example, and it also became like an icon for circularity.
So what we learned from the Keuvel is the power of community. When people own things and they can really spend their energy, you get to new heights in ambition. And that is also something that we saw in another project, Schoon Schip, which is a floating neighborhood that was initiated by citizens. So this one lady, Marianne de Blok, she had this dream. She wanted to live in a floating way and super sustainable in the middle of the city. And she was so enthusiastic about this idea that she also influenced a lot of her friends. We helped them to translate their idea into a plan. But what I thought was so special about the project is that their sustainable ambitions were really, really high. And they were also willing to spend the time and the energy to make them happen. So they created a group of parties that helped them with realizing it, and they created a smart grid. They share 500 solar panels and batteries that, with which they can share their power. They can sell power to their neighbor or take it back. They share a car sharing system. They even take energy out of their toilet waste. And well, these systems were not built before.
We think the neighborhood is the perfect scale for scaling up technology, but also the community impact, because the neighborhood is still very tangible. For example, the smart grid, which is implemented here at Schoon Schip, but also at other places in Germany, perfect synergy between the systems.
So the innovation power that communities have is something that we really learned that you should cherish that and kind of push it to create new things.
How do you define communities? What is a community? Is it us as a group of humans coming together? But as soon as you think about the realities that we are actually engaged with, you can argue that we are not alone. We're not alone even on our body and on our skin, because on our body and in our skin there are billions of microorganisms that basically cohabit this planet with us. We are a consortia, in a way, of multiple communities. The future of space is to recognize the agency that all of these communities beyond the human have in addressing our planet, our climate, our spaces, our way of living, inhabiting, and moving across this fragile planet. So what we need to design as architects are forms or spaces, in a way, for cooperation. When you look at it from this perspective, what we can design is the type of cooperation that we can actually engage with all these other agents.
I'm very keen of epigenetic. Epigenetic is a new science that has been born by the traditional genetic discipline. The cells are very much connected one to the other, and the cells develop and evolve because of their skin, the membrane around the cell. That means that the cells are continuously in touch with what happens around. And that means that the environment is fundamental for the single cells. We, as human beings, we have something like 13,000 trillions of cells in our body. They are all specialized in something, and they work together in a collaborative way. That's wonderful. We, as human beings, we are like cells. We have to collaborate as cells are doing in our body, and we have to create a body of humanity that can survive and can be much more happy in this planet and faithful for the future.
The Earth Station projects has become one of our vehicles to imagine what could be an architecture or a space and how we can improve the way that people behave together, the way that they can kind of react together, the way they can talk to each other, the way that they can be motivated by a space that makes them also more creative and want to participate in something. I think one of the most fascinating parts of the Earth Station story and process has been the idea that we've called many hands. We want to imagine how communities, whether they're in Antarctica or in Africa or wherever, how they can really bring together the traditional ways of making things, but use this in a contemporary way to make something that's meaningful for their community.
The Earth Station as architecture is to create the place in which all these different competencies meet together. And I thought that the idea of a medieval cathedral that can be the best way to represent the world of today, because today we need symbols, we need a place where to find out a reason to go and to share our knowledge, our competences, our emotions, where walls are not built to separate but to bring people together, and everything happens in the same time. Because, and this is very nice to discover, that the human creativity happens when you meet something unexpected. And it's very important, the definition of stations, because when I say stations, I mean place in which not to go to Mars or to the Moon or to another world similar to theirs, but to stay on this planet Earth, the cathedral of a new generation of spaces for, hopefully, a new humanity.
I hope that the definition of the future city could be more human through technology. It doesn't have to be smart, it needs to be more human. So the interest in having a human-centric design approach or looking at user groups, for instance, in the city, because in a way you want to know how you can orchestrate the city through the way people use the city. Design, especially in city planning, was often been seen a bit as a top-down approach. Infrastructure, housing, public spaces, policies were all kind of organized from the top. And I've always believed that it should change, that it should be connected to the way how people feel lonely in the city and how people want to be more together through community building. And I was always fascinated in the idea of how you could do that. How could you bring people more together? And I discovered that by collecting data, I tried to trace these user groups to finding out why these areas were so lively, for instance, or worked so well, and why certain other parts of the city didn't work so well. And that often had to do with the liveliness of the community. So it gave me a lot of new insight to work with data and technology in order to find new ways to make a better, more lively community, to mix the programs much better instead of making these monofunctional areas.
The main aspect of technology is the way that it simplifies the way that we live. So it's about how it can potentially capture the data of how people want to design spaces, how people utilize spaces and what their actual needs are. And how do we use that data in a way to pinpoint the needs of that society within that neighborhood to kind of create cultural relevance and spaces that actually meet the needs of those people. Every neighborhood has different requirements. And if you look at the demographic of each of those neighborhoods, they're not all the same. So their ambitions are very different from one space to another. So the data aspect of it can actually be used as a way to cultivate an understanding of that particular demographic within that space. How do we design those spaces to meet those needs?
when I went into practice and started understanding how the industry worked, it felt to me like the process in practice was devoid of a deeper dialogue between the people who were going to use the space and the people who were designing them. That void is what drew me to cognitive science, neuroscience, and psychology, is that it had such a wealth of knowledge that seemed to me a real waste that architects and designers aren't using, because it could tell us so much more about how people experience space and how we affect people with our design decisions.
We have to jump in a more sophisticated and technological world in which we can find a lot of possible solutions. Even today that we are studying neuroscience, we understand that mostly of the reality is in our head. In the science of neurologists, they say that we perceive only 20% of reality. All the rest is in our mind. All the rest is coming because of our way of thinking, our habits, our conventional behaviors, what our mother told us, what we learned in the school, and what we expect for ourselves, our dreams, our ambitions. But we have 80% of our way of living that can be changed, can be optimized, can become much better than what it is today.
So I think one of the opportunities that science-informed design and conscious design give us is the ability to allow people to learn about how they experience space and help them change the way they use a space. What I call that is spatial metacognition. For example, you might walk a specific route after trying all sorts of different routes to work because you know that's going to relax you before a meeting, or that's going to open up your ideas or inspire you. And it's the same about smart cities. So it's not enough to have smart cities, we also need smart citizens. If we help people understand why certain spaces make them feel a certain way or put them in certain states of mind, that spaces can be designed for specific experiences, then we also give them the opportunity to choose. And so this knowledge and this methodology isn't just about better spaces. It's about a healthier dialogue and a richer dialogue between person and space. But technology gives us now the opportunity to put numbers to experience, to help people understand how a certain space affects them. And the technology that we can use in science-informed design help us make the invisible visible. I think what we should be aiming for is as seamless a dialogue as we have with people. And that requires a lot of new thinking.
Well, I think it starts with building the social tissue, not just us, but I think people make up their social tissue by themselves, but technology empowers that and lowers the threshold to take part in a discussion level or in the network shaping and finding your peers, finding your like-minded or similar interests, whatever brings you together. So I think technology is a accessibility empowering instrument to make sure people talk to each other, connect with each other, relate to each other, and can stimulate interactive decision making. And I think that's the point we want to get into, that the city is made by people and not just for the people by the industry.
I guess one example would be decentralization, peer-to-peer technology, where, we've started to see that consumers are not necessarily going to brands or big companies for information, but actually seeking knowledge and relevance and awareness through the people that they know and trust within their network. Through the peer-to-peer approach, we actually learn from one another. I think it's already happening if we look at these peer-to-peer networks that are emerging, TikTok, for example. So I think as these technologies actually grow, it's actually going to be influencing the way in which we kind of produce things and the way that we actually bring the consumer into the fold within that system.
So what we see as technology that could really help for reaching our goals would be based on blockchain. So there's all these new features that are possible. Like the DAOs, the decentralized autonomous organizations, it's kind of software that helps with this democratic decision making. There's decentralized finance opportunities, so that money doesn't come from one big player, but can be coming from a lot of little players. And I think that technology is sort of getting ready for being able to reach these goals and this decentralized democracy.
That's also where we develop our own platforms and our own open processes, lots of them empowered by technologies to lower the threshold, to maximize our outreach and to maximize the contribution of individuals to really take part in the design and decision-making process. We believe that the end results should always be open, and we try to open up the process, but also the end result and the realized situation should also be open for change and open to adapt. And it also requires a bit more thinking in the architectural sense. What do you build? How do you construct? And do you foresee flexibility within your construct, within your neighborhood, and functional changes, programmatic changes, different target groups moving in, more senior housing, more starters housing, or maybe even a student population should be able to move in. So thinking about that level of flexibility or resiliency, that the infrastructure you provide should be always open for interaction and iteration. And it starts with the design process, but it also continues in the built environment afterwards.
I went to look for what are the sources that we can refer to and learn from that can move us away from making design decisions simply based on intuition and make them more on evidence. So if we are able to translate the science and the evidence that's coming out about how we experience space and how it affects us, not just in the moment, but also in the long term, then we can integrate that into the design methodology in a way that it becomes a new standard. And that new standard has a lot of different objectives. The primary objective is, of course, to make healthier environments and to make environments that are more attuned to the people who are in them. But the secondary objective is the fact that when you integrate ways of understanding how people experience space in the long run, what you get is a wealth of knowledge about how a space can evolve over time and become a better space to experience. And that completely redefines the idea of what the role of the architect is, from someone who is thought of as a profession that creates an end product and leaves at the end of a project, to a person who is intertwined with the evolution of a space and keeps on, through feedback, improving the experience.
Something very important that I learned is that in this time we have to unlearn a lot of stuff. When I think back to my years at university, what I learned as an architect, 80% is wrong. I have to unlearn that the profession of an architect means to set up walls. I mean, walls is horrible. Walls are the most negative objects that we can place on this planet. Walls are just a way to separate ourselves. I think that architects will possibly change very much if they start to think that walls should not be built just to separate, but to bring together, to make people to collaborate each other, to create a more effective and even happy society and organization.
I would like to believe that when we think of tomorrow living, we think about the quality of the dialogue between person and space. It is about how do we enhance a sense of agency and ownership by people in places.
You have a really good feeling because you do something better for the planet. The energy you produce or will be produced on the roof, for example, is not only used by you, but also by your neighbor if you don't use it, for example. The waste you produced will regenerate it in energy. This is tomorrow living.